Yo guys, Ponchy here, and today we're going to go over the LFO on our Analog 4 Mark II. Let's go! Alright guys, so in an effort to keep this one shorter, today we're just going to go over the parameters of the LFO, but I feel like the LFO is something that's going to require more than one video, so stay tuned for those. So the first parameter, SPD, that is of course the speed. Now by default it is set to 32, and being as it's on 32, that means that it will be synced with the BPM. So it will be, the speed of the LFO will be relative to your BPM. So if you set it at 16, 32, or 64, you'll always ensure that it is relative to your BPM, so it will always be in time basically. So, and of course, you know, the higher it is, the faster the speed will be. Now this is a bipolar setting, meaning that you can go into the negative, and so all that means is it'll play the LFO shape backwards rather than forwards. So that's definitely something interesting that you can do. MUL, that stands for the multiplier, which is self-explanatory. It will take the speed setting and it'll multiply that by whatever number you have set here, which by default is 16. So you have a couple other options though. You have a dot. Now what the dot will do will set the multiplier relative to 120 beats per minute, and it'll always be 120 regardless of your current tempo. So that's another way to control the speed. Okay, so FAD, that stands for fade. So using that parameter you can fade the LFO in or out. So judging by the curve there that it shows, it'll tell you whether it's fading in or out. So in the negative, it will be a gradual fade in, and then of course in the positive, it will be a gradual fade out. Or it can be not gradual. It's up to you. So now SPH, this one is interesting. This is the start phase. So the phase of a wave, you know, if you're at all familiar with math, the phase of a wave is basically kind of the peak or the trough, like how far away it is from the starting point, from the zero. So the start phase, normally the LFO starts at the 0 point, which would be, you know, right in the middle essentially. So using the start phase, you could have the LFO start either at the top of the wave, at the bottom. So generally, you know, that's probably something you're not going to use as much. You know, I hate to say you may or may not use something, but you know, that's one where at least if you're getting into the LFO, I wouldn't mess with that one too much. I would just leave it at 0. But of course, if you're feeling particularly adventurous, feeling particularly experimental, then I would start messing with that a little bit, you know. So of course the value only goes up to 127, and unfortunately it's not going to show you exactly where on the LFO wave that it starts, but using that parameter you can come up with some interesting results. So okay, so mod, that stands for mode. So this is probably one of the more interesting parts of the LFO, and if you're starting out with an LFO, I would just leave it on free for now, which essentially means that free, the LFO will run continuously, never stopping. So that's why I recommend starting with that, because ultimately that's the type of LFO that everyone is more familiar with, or I guess you could say it's probably the easiest one to wrap your head around. But ultimately there are other modes. So trig, the trig mode basically makes the LFO restart when a note is played. So if you can imagine, that's more relative to the trigs that you have laid on your pattern. Okay, so the next one is hold. So the interesting thing about hold is it's very similar to free, except if you set the LFO on hold on a certain trig, it will hold the LFO until another note is played. So again, these other modes are pretty advanced. You know, again, I'm not gonna go over what it sounds like right now. I'm just gonna tell you what each one of them does. One is the next one, and that basically makes it behave kind of like an envelope. So with this one, the LFO will start when you hit a note, but then it'll only go until the end of the note. So if you can imagine, if you have a note that doesn't have very much sustain or decay, then you might not hear it as much as you would if you had like a pad, for example, or a note that sustains for a long time. This one would be great for modulating pads, that's for sure. The next one is half. Now that one's similar to one, except instead of going for the whole wave, the whole sustain of the note, it'll only go halfway. So this one to me would be interesting used in conjunction with the fade. You know, ultimately fade and half and one, those are parameters that you can use so your LFO isn't so drastic, so you can get more, for lack of a better word, mild results out of your LFO. So those are all the different modes. Very interesting. Again, I'd recommend just starting with free, but you know, feel free to try them all when you're messing with your LFO. So wave, this is basically what dictates the behavior of the LFO, at least at the beginning. So the wave part determines how quickly and how slow, or how slowly the LFO is moving. And I don't mean speed. So essentially it's on this triangle wave by default. So, and luckily they give you a visual representation of what the wave looks like. So if you can imagine, the left side of the triangle here would be the 0 point. And then of course the top of the triangle is the peak, essentially. Probably should have mentioned this at the beginning, but what the LFO actually does is it takes a parameter that you select and it starts it at 0, and then it moves it all the way to its peak, as far as it'll go, and then it'll come back down. Now again, the LFO is a very like mathematical kind of thing. So if you want to look at it in terms of math, this is, a triangle is what you would call a linear change. It's like a linear slope. You know, I don't want to get too crazy about the math behind this, but the way to look at this is whatever parameter you select will start at 0 and it'll go up to its peak linearly, and then it'll come back down linearly. So I guess another way to look at that is kind of like a gradual rise and fall. Whereas if you do the next one like a sine wave can also be looked at as kind of gradual, but rather than going up in a very abrupt way, it's more of a smoother up and down motion, rather than like up and then straight back down and then up, straight back down, you know what I mean? So the sine wave is more of a gradual, like, you know, gradual up and down LFO motion. Another way of looking at the wave of the LFO is the motion, the way that it moves. So, and then square, The best way to look at square is it's kind of like an on and off kind of thing. So say for example you want to set your LFO to I don't know, like a reverb for example. If you chose the LFO to modulate the reverb, then it would basically, and you had a square wave, it would basically go on and off. It would be like, it's like flipping a light switch up and down, you know. There's no in between with the light switch. It's either just off or on. So that's the best way to look at a square wave. Those can sound, you know, using those with your LFO can sound really abrupt, can make things sound abrupt. So the saw wave, again, the best way to look at it is to just look at the actual picture and imagine turning a parameter up and down. Another way to look at an LFO is that it's like having an extra hand in a sense. So being as we only have two hands, you know, we can only, or 10 fingers, however you want to look at it, or 8 fingers and 2 thumbs for you purists out there. But, you know, there's only so many things that we can move at once. So an LFO is like having another hand for you to modulate a parameter, but it'll do it on its own without you having to do anything. So with your saw wave here, it'll start high, it'll start at the peak of whatever parameter you're using, and then it'll go down. So every time it restarts, it'll go straight from 0 all the way back up to the top, kind of like the square wave a little bit. But you know, ultimately the saw wave will just be always going down, always starting from the top, going down, and then once it hits the bottom, it'll immediately start back up at the top. So that's the thing about the square wave. And then here you have basically an exponential wave. Now what that does is it's very similar to the saw wave, but instead of coming down linearly, like a linear slope, it comes down super fast. So it'll start at the peak and then it'll come down really quickly. So depending on how high you have your speed and your multiplier set, this could sound really abrupt. You could probably almost make it sound like a square wave, but you know, it'll have a little bit different behavior than the square wave. But yeah, so that's the exponential wave. So the ramp, that basically, again, the picture is the best way to look at it. It'll start at 0, it'll reach the peak slowly, and then it'll just immediately drop off. So it's kind of like a combination between like a triangle and a square wave in a way, or kind of like a combination of the sawtooth and the square. So that's the best way to look at that. And keep in mind, when I refer to these waves, I'm not talking about the waves of your oscillators. That's completely different. This only refers to the wave of the LFO, which essentially is like taking your, again, it's like holding a knob and like turning it up or turning it down at a certain speed. So, and then random, as the picture suggests, it's very random. You never know what you'll get with that. You know, so that's a way to get, you know, extremely experimental sounds out of your LFO. So if you truly want your parameters to be just like, you know, 1 second it's all the way up, next second it's quarter of the way, third of the way, 0, 75%, you know what I mean? Like, it'll do all that stuff for you, so you don't have to worry about that. So destination, I'm not going to go through this one in depth because it would take all week because when you look through the destination menu, you basically have access to all these different parameters. Now, what they've done, however, is you might notice you have two destination sections here. What they've done is made it so you can have two different destinations. Now, they do both come from the same list, so you can indeed modulate the same destination. However, you might not get the you might not get the results that you would expect out of that. So using this, you can basically modulate two different destinations at the same time. The destination and the waveform are probably the most important aspects of the LFO, because the waveform determines how the LFO is going to move up and down, and then the destination determines which knob you're turning. So which knob that the LFO is turning, basically, which parameter. So that's the best way to look at it. The depth is, again, a bipolar knob, and basically that means that you can go either positive or negative, but the depth, it controls how much of the LFO you're getting, how much of the destination is being modulated, basically. That's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, leave a comment below. The LFO is probably one of the harder things to wrap your head around at first, but once you learn how to use the LFO, it's insane the amount of stuff that you can do. Like, the best use that I can describe for the LFO is to give your sounds motion. So it's a way to take a note. I just have a simple patch pulled up here. Those notes are just very simple, just flat. They're not moving at all. So the LFO is a way to make it sound like it's moving without you having to actually physically turn the knobs. Just real quick, one application you could do with it is to use it to modulate the filter cutoff. The one that, to give you those amazing filter sweeps that we all love. Rather than you having to physically hold the note and move the filter, you could have the LFO move the filter for you. So that's the most obvious use of the LFO. And then, when you factor in the waveforms, the different waveforms and the different speeds, you can definitely get some interesting results modulating the filter that you probably wouldn't be able to do, with your hand. So that's the best way to look at the LFO. So again, I will be doing some more videos on the LFO, so stay tuned for those. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.